In the winter of 1846, high in the snow-choked mountains of the Sierra Nevada, a group of American pioneers faced a terrible choice: starve to death or commit the ultimate taboo. This is the story of how a journey to paradise spiraled into a frozen hell, and how families were forced to feast on the flesh of their own just to survive. It's a story of ambition, bad decisions, and the terrifying limits of what humans can endure. A story that, for a long time, America tried to forget. This story doesn't start in darkness, but with a dream. In the spring of 1846, California fever was sweeping across the United States. Newspapers and letters were filled with tales of a literal paradise on the Pacific coast, a land of rich soil, perfect weather, and endless opportunity. For farmers and businessmen in Springfield, Illinois, this dream was intoxicating. Among them were two well-off brothers, George and Jacob Donner, and their ambitious neighbor, James F. Reed, a successful furniture maker. Together, with their wives and children, they organized a wagon train, pooling their money for the brutal 2,500-mile journey west. On April 14, 1846, the first group of 31 people set out from Springfield with 9 wagons, their spirits soaring. They weren't alone. When they reached Independence, Missouri, the chaotic starting point for the great overland trails, they joined a much larger wagon train. The place was buzzing with a kind of organized chaos and shared hope. Hundreds of wagons, thousands of cattle, and families from all walks of life were getting ready to chase the sun. The Donner Reed Party, as it became known, was well-funded and well-supplied. James Reed's wagon was particularly famous, a testament to his wealth and, maybe, his overconfidence. Nicknamed the Pioneer Palace Car, it was a massive, custom-built wagon, with some claiming it was a 2-story mansion on wheels, complete with a stove and plush seats. It was so huge it took 8 oxen to pull it. The first part of the journey followed the well-worn Oregon Trail, and for weeks, everything went smoothly. But a critical mistake had already been made, one they didn't know about yet. For some reason, they'd left Independence on May 12th, weeks later than the ideal mid-April start. This late start left them almost no room for error on a journey where timing was everything. Every day they lost was another day closer to the deadly grip of a mountain winter. The first real step toward disaster came in the form of a book they found at Fort Laramie, Wyoming. The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, written by a charismatic promoter named Lansford W. Hastings, was the talk of the trail that year. Hastings had big dreams of building his own empire in California, and his book advertised a new shortcut that he claimed would shave over 300 miles off the trip. This Hastings Cutoff left the main trail at Fort Bridger and cut straight across the desert south of the Great Salt Lake. The problem? Hastings himself had never actually taken a wagon over the full length of his own shortcut. His claims were based on the journey of a single explorer on horseback, who wasn't dragging heavy wagons or traveling with women and children. Seasoned mountain men knew the terrain was dangerous and warned people away from it. In fact, a friend of James Reed, a frontiersman named James Clyman, had just come from that direction and met the party at Fort Bridger. He told Reed point-blank not to take the cutoff, saying it was barely passable for a man on a mule and totally unfit for wagons. But even with such a direct warning, the promise of saving a month of travel was just too tempting, especially since they knew they were behind schedule. On July 19, 1846, the party made its fateful choice. They broke away from the main wagon train, elected George Donner their captain, and turned south. The Donner Party, now 87 people and about 23 wagons, was gambling everything on the word of a man they'd never even met. Lansford Hastings had promised he'd wait at Fort Bridger to guide them. He didn't. He'd already left with an earlier group, leaving only a set of notes for anyone who followed. The Donner Party was now completely on its own, venturing into a landscape none of them had ever seen. The shortcut was a lie. In the end, The Hastings Cutoff was actually 125 miles longer than the established route and would lead them through some of the most brutal terrain in North America. This shortcut immediately turned into a nightmare. First came the Wasatch Mountains in Utah. The trail Hastings had described as a manageable path was really a rugged canyon choked with dense thickets of trees. For 16 miserable days, the men had to become road builders, hacking a path and double-teaming their oxen to drag the wagons up impossibly steep slopes. The work was exhausting, but the damage to their morale was worse. They were burning through precious time, and nerves began to fray. After finally clearing the mountains, they came face to face with an even worse enemy, the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had claimed this was a dry drive of about 40 miles that would take 2 days. It was actually 80 miles, and it took them 5. The desert was a merciless, alien world. The shimmering heat created cruel mirages of lakes, and the salt-crusted ground blinded them with the reflection of the sun. The wagon wheels sank into the soft ground, finishing off their already weakened oxen. One by one, their water barrels ran dry. The cattle, driven mad by thirst, bolted into the desert and were lost forever. James Reed had to abandon 2 of his wagons, including his magnificent Pioneer Palace car. By the time they finally stumbled out of the desert, they'd lost 36 cattle and 4 wagons. The group was demoralized. Their supplies were running dangerously low, and the shortcut had cost them an entire month. Tensions that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over. In early October, a dispute over tangled wagon teams exploded into violence. A teamster named John Snyder started whipping James Reed's oxen. When Reed stepped in, Snyder turned the whip on him. In the fight that followed, Reed fatally stabbed Snyder with a hunting knife. Some in the party wanted to hang Reed on the spot. Instead, they banished him. With no weapons and a little food, James Reed was forced to ride on ahead alone, leaving his wife and children behind with the fractured group. This act shattered what little unity the party had left, leaving them leaderless and divided as they faced the last and most dangerous barrier on their journey, the Sierra Nevada mountains. After the horror of the desert, the party limped toward the main California trail, finally rejoining it in late September. But it was far, far too late. Every other group of pioneers from 1846 was already safe in California. The Donner Party was all alone, racing against a winter they couldn't outrun. They reached the base of the Sierra Nevada in late October, completely exhausted and almost out of food. They knew the danger but clung to a small bit of hope they'd been given, that the pass would stay clear until mid-November. Just as they were preparing for that final climb, an unusually early and vicious winter storm slammed into the mountains. On October 28th, they made camp near what we now call Donner Lake. That night, the snow began to fall. When they woke up, the world was buried in white. They made a desperate push to get the wagons over the pass, but were stopped by 5-foot snow drifts. They had no choice but to retreat to the lake. More storms rolled in, one after another. For 8 straight days, it snowed relentlessly, burying their wagons, their tents, and their last hopes. The snow at their camp rose to 10 feet deep, with drifts on the summit reaching over 20 feet. The pass was completely blocked. They were trapped. Forced to accept their grim new reality, the party settled in for the winter. They split into 2 camps. Most of the families, including the Reeds and Breens, stayed at the lake, throwing together crude cabins from logs and wagon parts, using hides for roofs. The Donner families, who had fallen behind after a wagon accident, were stuck about 6 miles away, living in makeshift tents. All told, 81 men, women, and children were caught in this frozen prison, and more than half of them were under 18. Their nightmare was just beginning. The first few weeks were a slow slide into pure misery. Their remaining oxen, their main food source, started dying of starvation or wandered off into the deep snow. They stacked the frozen carcasses like firewood, a grim pantry for the months ahead. Once that meat was gone, They turned to anything else they could find. They ate their pet dogs. They chewed on boiled leather from their shoes and harnesses. They scraped bark from trees and boiled strips of oxhide into a foul, glue-like jelly that barely kept them alive. One of the immigrants, an Irishman named Patrick Breen, kept a diary that gives us a chilling, first-hand account of their ordeal. His entries are short but powerful. Snowing fast. Wind W. Snows faster than it can melt, he wrote on November 29th. Still snowing now about 3 feet deep. Wind W. As the weeks dragged on, his diary became a catalog of dwindling food, brutal cold, and the slow creep of death. People grew weaker, spending most of their days huddled in the dark, smoky cabins to save energy. The children suffered terribly. Sickness spread. On December 15th, a young man named Bayless Williams died of malnutrition. He was the first to die in the camps, but he wouldn't be the last. The constant hunger ate away at their bodies and their minds. Hope vanished with every fresh snowfall. They were prisoners of the weather, staring out at a silent, white world that had become their tomb. It became terrifyingly clear that if help didn't come soon, and if they didn't do something drastic, no one was getting out of there alive. The stage was set for the most desperate act of all. By mid-December, with no sign of the weather breaking, a small group decided to make one last, desperate attempt to get over the mountains for help. 15 of the strongest members, 10 men and 5 women, fashioned crude snowshoes and set out on December 16th. They carried barely enough food for 6 days. They would become known as the Forlorn Hope. Their journey was an epic of suffering. On the 6th day, completely lost and out of food, they were trapped in a brutal blizzard. 4 of them died. Huddled in a pit they dug in the snow, freezing and starving, the survivors faced a horrific choice. One of the men, Patrick Dolan, was the first to suggest they eat the bodies of the dead. At first, they refused, but as another day passed, they gave in. In a scene that's hard to even imagine, they stripped the flesh from their fallen comrades, roasted it, and ate, averting their eyes from each other and weeping, as one later wrote. The ordeal of the Forlorn Hope lasted 33 agonizing days. More people died. In a final, dark twist, 2 Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador, who had been with them, were shot and killed by one of the starving pioneers, William Foster, so he could eat their bodies. Finally, after more than a month, 7 exhausted survivors stumbled into a Native American village, looking more like skeletons than people. Their arrival finally alerted the settlements in California to the disaster happening in the mountains. Back at the camps, things had gotten even worse. People were dying frequently from starvation and sickness. With the strongest members gone with the Forlorn Hope, nearly 2/3 of those left behind were children. As the dead were buried in the snow, the living faced the same awful dilemma. The taboo was finally broken. To keep their children and themselves alive, they started digging up the corpses of their friends and family. They carved up the bodies, boiled the organs, and roasted the flesh, taking care to make sure that no one had to eat their own relatives. Patrick Breen's diary captured the horror with grim simplicity. On February 26th, he wrote, "Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that she thought she would commence on Milt and eat him. I don't that she has done so yet. It is distressing. This wasn't an act of monstrous savagery. It was a calculated, last-ditch effort to survive. The final, agonizing sacrifice in a nightmare that seemed to have no end." The story told by the survivors of the Forlorn Hope lit a fire under the settlements in California. A rescue effort was quickly put together, but the same snow that had trapped the pioneers made reaching them almost impossible. The first relief party, just 7 men, finally fought their way to the lake camp on February 18th, nearly 4 months after the party was first trapped. The scene they found was one of unspeakable horror. The survivors were skeletal, their eyes wild. The filthy cabins reeked of death. Mutilated bodies lay half buried in the snow, and pots held the remains of human flesh. That first rescue party could only take 23 of the strongest survivors, most of them children. 3 more rescue parties would follow over the next 2 months, each one finding fewer people alive and more evidence of cannibalism. The second relief party included the banished James Reed, who finally managed to rescue his own family. The third relief gave them a hero, a man named John Stark, who single-handedly carried 9 stranded children to safety, 2 at a time. The last relief party arrived in mid-April. At the Alder Creek camp, they found the body of George Donner, his head split open, apparently to get at his brain. At the lake camp, they found only one person alive, a German immigrant named Louis Keseberg, surrounded by dismembered bodies. He was accused of murdering Tamsin Donner for her money and her flesh, though he was never convicted. Keseberg's story cemented him as the villain of the tragedy, the face of its darkest chapter. Of the 87 members of the Donner Party who took the Hastings Cutoff, only 48 survived. The families who started the journey with such high hopes were shattered. The Reed and Breen families were the only 2 to make it to California without losing a single member. The story of the Donner Party is a brutal but powerful testament to the human will to survive against impossible odds. If this chronicle of their tragic journey grabbed you and you want to explore more forgotten chapters of history, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It helps us keep telling these important stories. So what is the legacy of the Donner Party? For a long time, America wanted to forget the gruesome details, either sanitizing the story or treating it like a cheap horror tale. But the tragedy became a dark footnote in the heroic story of westward expansion, a grim reminder of the incredible risks pioneers faced and the absolute, unforgiving power of nature. The survivors went on to build new lives in California. Many became prominent citizens, and the Reed family even has streets in San Jose named after them. But they all carried the physical and psychological scars of what they endured for the rest of their lives. In the end, their story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question about who we are. When you strip away everything, food, shelter, hope, and the rules of civilization, what are people capable of? The choices made in that frozen hell weren't about right and wrong in a world of comfort, but about the raw, primal need to see another sunrise. And it leaves you wondering, if you were faced with the same impossible choice, what would you have done?